Professor Marcus Plague stood at the front of the now empty room gathering his notes. His presentation audience had left a few minutes ago, and he was preparing to do the same, albeit hesitant to step outside the room in fear of running into the corpser that had breached containment. He was more than ready to take on the entity himself, until he read through its file and realized the extent of how dangerous it was. For the first time in what felt like a long time, he was understandably having second thoughts about diving headfirst into his goal. He closed the last folder and stacked the files on top of each other, when he heard horrific sounds echoing through the halls right outside the room he was in. His heart sank. Nightmares beyond normal human comprehension were an everyday part of the job, as were, to a lesser degree, containment breaches. But there was something about the corpsers that really got to Professor Marcus Plague, in a way that no other SCP in the Foundation did. He lowered himself behind the podium, peeking over the ledge and watching the doorway at the opposite end of the room, hoping that if the corpser was out there, it would walk past this room without noticing him. Unfortunately, hope didn't hold much weight. The escaped corpser filled the doorway, and immediately its head turned to look inside the room. Professor Marcus Plague quickly ducked his head behind the podium to hide from the entity's gaze. He sat clutching his files, carefully listening to what was happening on the other side of the room. The entity snarled as it lurked around the room, pushing aside tables like they weren't even there. Professor Marcus Plague heard the noises becoming louder and louder as the entity got closer and closer. He frantically but quietly opened the corpse's file and began reading through the paragraphs of information, trying to see if there was anything he could do to fend off the approaching horror. To his dismay, there was nothing the professor could do in his current situation. He shut his eyes tight, preparing for the worst. The sounds were deafening, second only to the pounding of his heart. He could tell that the corpser was practically on top of him now. With seemingly no ways to escape, Professor Marcus Plague let out a deep sigh, accepting whatever was about to happen next. The corpser stepped closer and leaned his head down to his level. It slowly crept around the podium, its blank eyes landing on fresh meat. The corpser stood back up to its full height and let out a harrowing roar. It threw its head against the podium, sending it flying into the wall and shattering it into splinters. Professor Marcus Plague tensed up as this cover was destroyed. He waited for anything to happen. The pain of his teeth sinking into his flesh, the horrible feeling of being infected by the entity's parasites, the burning sensation of the acid, anything at all that would signify this being over soon. Instead, there was nothing. The professor realized that there were no sounds either. The room had become silent. Hesitantly, he glanced to his left and looked at the escaped entity, his eyes glowing wide in amazement. The corpser was frozen in place. Not only that, but it was drained of all its colors. Its sickly yellow skin and muscly face were now various shades of black and white. Professor Marcus Plague slowly backed away from the corpser, when he noticed a set of numbers floating above the corpser's head. There were two sets of numbers, both 2 digits long. A larger set of numbers was counting down much slower than the smaller set. He realized it was a countdown, though he didn't know what it was counting down to. But he sure as hell didn't want to stick around to find out. Still confused by the corpser frozen in place, Professor Marcus Plague gathered the files and rushed out of the room. He ran fast as he could down the hall, trying to put as much distance between himself and the corpser as possible. He had no idea what the timer above the entity's head related to, or if it was going to unfreeze or explode when time was up. Anything was on the table when it came to the abilities of the entities at the SCP Foundation. Suddenly from behind him, the corpser roared again, giving Professor Marcus Plague the answer he was dreading. However, he also could have sworn that he heard the faint sound of a duck quacking coming from somewhere inside the facility. He tried to ignore it, focusing on maintaining distance between him and the creature. He remembered that the corpser's main weakness was extreme heat. If he could get to the weapon storage, he may be able to have some defense against the creature. The professor hooked a left and continued running. He considered for a moment taking a path with several wrong turns to try to throw the corpse off his trail, but he decided it probably wouldn't be a very effective strategy. He continued to make his way towards the weapon storage, listening for any sounds that would indicate the corpser was near. As he rounded another corner, he felt himself run into something solid and fall to the ground. I could have sworn there was an adjoining hall there. though it wouldn't be the first time I've turned into a wall," he said as he sat on the ground rubbing his head. He looked up, and it turns out he was right. There was a hall there. What he ran into was actually a person. The person was wearing a lab coat just like him, albeit without a cool leather jacket underneath. However, Professor Marcus Plague took note that the man had what appeared to be a steampunk duck tucked underneath his arm. "Hey, watch it, buddy. If you haven't noticed, there's an entity on the loose, and I really don't want to be its next meal." The corpser. "I'm well aware. I've had the displeasure of encountering it myself," the man replied in a semi-serious tone. Well, huge thanks for taking it out. That thing nearly ate me alive. Luckily, it stopped right before it got to me. Must have realized I wouldn't taste too good." "That could be it. Or maybe someone saved you at the last minute by using another SCP to freeze the corpser in place, and giving you the chance to escape." The man shifted the duck underneath his arm as he spoke. "Oddly specific, but that's possible. Nevertheless, now that you have me, what's the plan to take this thing down? I was gonna blast it with a heat gun and light that thing up." The man looked away from Professor Marcus Plague as he sucked in air through his teeth. He let out a sigh and spoke. "Not a bad strategy. However, there's one major issue. The O5 Council has denied authorizations to dispose of the corpser entity. They said more research is required on the entity to understand the extent of its abilities and accurately determine what kind of threat it poses to mankind. As long as the corpser remains inside this facility, lethal force is prohibited." Son of a... For the first time, Professor Marcus Plague finally turned and acknowledged the duck that was held in the man's arm. He studied it closely, fully taking in its odd appearance. It was almost like someone took a pocket watch and a duck and smashed them together. One of the duck's eyes was replaced with a timer with a small digital display. A watch crown stuck out of the side of its head, and it had a network of gears inside it, exposed via a glass pane on its stomach. It could have just been the adrenaline from all the running, but he could have sworn he also heard a faint ticking coming from the duck. "Okay, so it sounds like our best, nay, only plan of action is to recontain this thing and then the nightmare will be over, yes? In that case, I think we should still go and equip ourselves with the heat guns. We won't use the lethal force, but maybe we can weaken it and herd it back inside its cell, like some kind of bloodthirsty zombie sheep." "I agree. The extra help couldn't hurt." Professor Marcus Plague didn't move, confused by the man's choice of words. He sure didn't have anything on him besides the files, and his new accomplice was cradling a duck under his arms. As far as he knew, anything they were able to get their hands on would be the only help they had. "Shall we get going?" "Yes, my apologies. We don't want to stand around too long in one place. Sorry, I didn't catch your name." "I'm Dr. Bill Dye, but I usually just go by William." "And you are?" "Professor Marcus Plague and only Professor Marcus Plague." "Let's get going." The two Foundation members continued walking down the hall towards the weapons storage, being cautious and checking to make sure the corpser wasn't lurking around. The whole time, Professor Marcus Plague kept glancing over at the duck in Dr. Bill's arms. It had remained silent for the entire trip, save for the one time it censored him. "Hey, Dr. Bill Dye? I told you William is fine." "Fine. Hey, William? What's the deal with that robo-duck in your arms? After I escaped the corpse in the presentation room, I thought I heard the sound of a duck quacking. Does that duck have some kind of special ability?" I was genuinely concerned you didn't notice him. This is SCP-KP-522, but I usually just refer to him as Duck Scare. Duck Scare? That's a really weird name, even by SCP entity standards. Indeed, but I'll explain why shortly. However, I have to provide some backstory for you first. Since you seem to be unaware of this entity, I'm going to assume that you did not join the personnel meetings that updated us on newly captured SCPs. Maybe, maybe not. You don't have any proof I didn't. Besides, I run the SCP featured presentation, so I learn all about the SCPs we have contained here. Eventually. Right. As I've mentioned, this little guy right here is Duck Scare, and he has the ability to freeze an individual in place for up to 60 seconds. William held up Duck Scare for Professor Marcus Plague to see. All I have to do is pop out this dial on the side of its head, twist it to set the duration of the time freeze, and press it back in to activate. As I press the dial in, I have to point Duck Scare at my target, specifically his clock eye. Once a target has been affected, it will become desaturated so I can easily distinguish it, and a little timer will appear above it, informing me how much time is left until it unfreezes. The timer is also displayed on Duck Scare's clock eye right here. As a result, I am only able to freeze one target in time at a time. While the target is frozen, I can either reposition myself to a more advantageous location or find a means of escape. No way, that thing's insane! So can we just freeze the corpse for a minute, push it somewhere else, and then when the time's up do it again and again till it's back in its cell? Not quite. Duck Scare doesn't allow me to interact directly with the targets while they're frozen in time. I can set up things like traps for it to trigger as soon as it unfreezes, but I can't do anything that would make contact with it while it's frozen. Duck Scare's abilities are best suited for defensive combat. I'm sure there's a few ways that it can be utilized for attack, but I know for certain that with Duck Scare around, stealth is an absolute no-go. Why not? It seems like that would be super helpful when it comes to sneaking around. Yes, but looks are often deceptive. When the timer reaches 0 and the target unfreezes, Duck Scare will continuously quack in loud short bursts until somebody presses down on his bill. Though for some reason I always seem to forget that he does that, and it startles me every time. Hence the name Duck Scare. That's incredible! That thing paired with the heat guns will make recontaining this thing a breeze! The two continued down the halls until they can see the door to the weapons storage. Professor Marcus Plague was about to pick up the pace and go inside, when he was suddenly pulled into a side hall by William. What the heck? We're right here! What's the deal? William just put a finger to his lips and then simply pointed around the corner, signaling for Professor Marcus Plague to take a peek. He craned his head and looked in the direction of the weapons storage. A short ways past the entrance to the storage, the corpser was lurking around. It appeared that it hadn't noticed them before they ducked into the side hall. Oh, come on, it's pretty far from the door. We could have made it before it even noticed us, if you didn't pull us in here. Anyway, new plan. I'm going forward, and if the corpser notices me, you hit it with Duck Scare. Sound good? Alright. Without waiting for a response, Professor Marcus Plague bolted out from the corner, ready to make a mad dash toward the weapon storage. Suddenly, the entire world blurred around him. It was hard to tell since the walls, floor, and ceiling were all mostly gray, but the professor could tell that the few colors that were surrounding him had been removed. Though he couldn't move or speak, he could still see and hear, though everything was either gray, muffled, and/or blurry. He'd been duck scared. It took a little bit for Professor Marcus Plague to get over the shock of being frozen, but when he finally took in his surroundings, he realized he was far away from the hallway he and William were hiding behind. He was out in the open, and directly in line of sight of the corpser, completely defenseless. To make matters worse, Professor Marcus Plague could see the shape of the corpser turning its head in his direction. He heard its muffled roar as the shape got bigger and bigger. Luckily, the corpser couldn't get to him while he was frozen, but he couldn't see how much time he had left before the effects of Duck Scare wore off. The corpser was getting closer and closer when Professor Marcus Plague saw another shape step into frame. It took him a minute, but he realized who the shape belonged to. Professor Marcus Plague. I don't know if you can see or hear me while frozen. I've never been able to test it. But if you can make out anything I'm saying right now, I hope you'll take care of Duck Scare and utilize him to get this thing back in containment. It's my fault I turned you into a sitting duck for the corpser. No pun intended. I'll lure this thing away so you can grab Duck Scare and a heat gun and recontain this damn thing. William's shape disappeared, soon followed by the shape of the corpser. Professor Marcus Plague tried to scream for William to stop, but as long as he was frozen, he couldn't do anything. For what felt like hours, Professor Marcus Plague stared blankly into the gray void of the world around him. Eventually, the colors returned to the world, and he fell to the ground, having been mid-run when he was frozen. The professor looked to his left where Duck Scare was quacking away, signaling that Professor Marcus Plague had been unfrozen. He dove and slammed his hand on the entity's bill, hoping the sound wouldn't lure the corpser back to him. One thing was for sure, that quacking was indeed startling. The professor picked up Duck Scare, tucked him underneath his arms, and hurried over to the weapons cache. He grabbed a heat gun off the rack and cranked up the heat intensity. He stepped out of the storage room and headed in the direction that William ran in. Professor Marcus Plague roamed the empty halls, keeping an eye out for either the Corpser or William, if there was anything left of him. He wanted to believe that William was able to outrun the entity and hide, but he knew it was a long shot. He kept walking, listening out for the sound of the Corpser, when suddenly he heard its faint snarling echo around the walls. Professor Marcus Plague pressed his back against the wall and peeked around the corner. But the coast was clear. He heard it again and whipped his head around, but there was nothing behind him either. The noises persisted, but there was nothing around. A drop of something hit the ground right next to Professor Marcus Plague's foot. He turned around and looked upwards to see the Corpser hanging from the ceiling. The professor nearly dropped Duck Scare as he pointed the heat gun towards the entity and pulled the trigger. A massive wave of heat radiated in the Corpser's direction. It screamed in pain and let go of the ceiling, falling to the ground. He approached the entity, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the heat gun as he stared daggers at the creature. He didn't let up as the Corpser wriggled around under the intense heat. Suddenly, he remembered what William had told him about the O5 Council denying permission to kill the Corpser. His finger lifted off the trigger as he continued to stare at the Corpser with fire in his eyes. The entity struggled to get back up. The professor put the heat gun behind his back and started fiddling with the dial on the side of Duck Scare's head, calculating how much time we'd need to put some distance between himself and the Corpser, without the Corpser losing sight of him. The Corpser managed to get onto its feet and was eyeing Professor Marcus Plague, ready to give chase to its next meal. The professor pointed Duck Scare at the Corpser and pressed the dial. Immediately, the Corpser was bathed in black and white, and the timer counting down from 20 seconds appeared above it. The professor took off sprinting down the hall, heading towards the Corpser's containment cell. He continued the long journey to the containment cell, making sure the Corpser always had him within its line of sight. Whenever it got too close for comfort, he would flash Duck Scare at it again, and use the few seconds to get further ahead. Finally, he reached the entity's containment cell. He opened the door and stepped inside, making sure that the Corpser could easily see him. The entity picked up the pace, realizing its prey was cornered with nowhere to go. It flew through the door of the cell, rapidly gaining on Professor Marcus Plague, who now had his back turned to the creature. It was just about to strike when the professor turned around, hit the dial on Duck Scare's head, and froze the Corpser in place. The timer on Duck Scare counted down as Professor Marcus Plague calmly strolled out of the cell and shut the door, containing the Corpser once again. And there we go. We've got a new character to add to whatever I end up naming this series of original stories that I got going on here. Haven't figured it out yet, so the title will remain Unnamed Overarching Series for now. But I want to say thank you so much to the stream chat who suggested turning a silly little bit of me getting scared by a timer into an actual character that we can incorporate into our series. It turned out so cool. I love the powers I gave it, and I really hope all of you enjoy it too. I know for a fact that I want to buy something with Duck Scare on it. And if any of you are interested in that too, there'll be a whole line of Duck Scare related merch over on my Teespring store with a link in the description, if I remember to do that by the time this video goes out. But that's all I've got for you today. Thank you all so much for joining and watching this video. If you had fun, feel free to hit the like and subscribe button. My name is KyngPin Creation, and I will see all of you in the next video. Take care, everybody.